I was wondering how you learned so much about the copper mines.
How I learned so much? Well, to be truthful, I was the principal at Thetford Elementary School a long time ago. And when I was there, a janitor, or a maintenance person, told me he had worked in the copper mine. And I'm not from around here. I said, copper mine? What do you mean copper mine? And then he started telling me the story about a copper mine. And then I learned that the bus driver also worked in the copper mine. And I began to realize that a lot of people knew about the copper mine and I didn't know much. So I started to get interested in the copper mine. And then when I moved to Strafford, because I used to live in Thetford, I got interested in the Historical Society and the mine. And that's sort of the short story of how I got started on it. Got so interested I even wrote a book on it.
Really?
Yeah.
Could you give us an overview of the history of the copper mine?
Yeah, it's hard to give you a short version, but I will. Now, in the beginning, you have to realize there was no electricity, no real machinery, no running water. These people discovered brownish water in a stream, and it was recognized as copper. There must be copper. They thought they were going to find iron too, because the two usually are found together. So they thought, oh, well, there's big money to be made in iron, so we'll go for iron. And they tried to dynamite and pound with sledgehammers and get enough ore out that they could have it tested. They did that over in New Hampshire, and it was so bad, the ore, that it broke the blast furnace over there, and they decided that what they got wasn't worth it, so maybe copper. But up here now, this is a long ways from anywhere, especially back 200 years ago. There were no railroads. There were no cars or trucks. So if they were to get stuff that was useful, like ore, copper ore, they were dependent on horses and wagons, and it made it very, very expensive to do it. And these guys worked for a good many years trying to get copper ore out of here. A man named Tyson came along and he said, rather than ship all that ore out of here, why don't we build blast furnaces right here in Strafford and melt the stuff down right here. We won't have to do that. And he began experimenting with that here. You came through a section of road called, you'll see a sign that says Furnace Flat. When you go back, it says Furnace Flat on a big sign. And there were actually 7 or 8 smelting furnaces there. And they were more or less successful, but copper is either expensive or not, depending on how much demand there is for it. And so the copper industry went up and down. It closed, it opened. It wasn't consistent all the way through. And it got its biggest shot in the arm after 1930. It closed down during the Depression. It stayed closed for about 12 years. And then the Second World War came. And there was a huge demand for copper, for everything in battleships, airplanes, everything that the military needed. So they rebuilt the mine, which was a place where 220 men worked every day. And they worked in tunnels underground. There are 5 miles of tunnels under that hill. It stretches for 2.5 miles long. And it was a very productive and important place. And of course, for people like Thetford people, Strafford people, Sharon people, it meant jobs. And they paid really well. And they were very productive right up through the Korean War, which took it up into the 1950s. And then after that, mining in this country went west. The big copper mines are out in the west and the southwest. They're gigantic mines. You know, some of the trucks and vehicles they use are almost as big as this building. What they had here is really small potatoes compared to that, and they couldn't compete, so it closed in 1957.
What food would miners have brought with them for lunch in the 1900s?
That's a very good question, and it was a very important thing for the men, believe me. The story was that the men never forgot two things. Do you know what they might have been?
Their lunch and their hard hat?
That's right. The hard hat, especially with the light on it, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, they had to have those two things, and if you had those two things, they felt pretty good about going down in the mine. Of course, they had to eat down in the mine. They all had lunch kits that they brought. A very popular thing for men to eat in the mine at that time, and you're talking about the 1900s, even the early 1900s, was salt pork, which is like a thick piece of pork fat, basically, which has been in salt for a long time, and it's a high energy food. Because they used up a lot of energy to do the work they did, but they liked bread and salt pork. That was a very important part of their menu.
I don't know if I would eat that.
No, I don't think you would. And of course, they love to have coffee and tea. Yeah, things like that.
So did they have like a special spot in the mine to eat?
Yes, they did. They had what you today in school would call a lunchroom, I guess, or something like that. Yeah. But you had these tunnels, but every once in a while they'd have a room off of the tunnel. Mm-hmm. That they had benches in it, and they would all gather in there at lunchtime and have lunch. Yeah.
Where did you go to the bathroom in the mine?
Well, obviously you would have to do that, wouldn't you? And they didn't treat that any differently underground than they did above ground. They actually had what amounted to an indoor outhouse. Have you ever used an outhouse?
No, but I've seen them.
You've seen outhouses, yeah. What it is they dig a pit pretty far down, and then they build like a bench. And one of the things that was produced up there beside copper was something called copperas, which is a turquoise-colored crystal substance. And they would take copperas and put it down in the hole because it is a disinfectant, and it would reduce any odors or anything like that. So they had their own disinfectant, you might say, built right into the mine.
Were there tracks for carts throughout all 5 miles of the tunnel?
Pretty nearly so, not all 5 miles, but there were really a lot of railroad tracks. Now, in the earliest days of the mine, there were also tracks, and horses and mules pulled carts on those tracks. Because they didn't have electricity, they were dependent on horses and mules to pull carts, which they would fill with ore and then bring back out of the mine. In 1942, when they built this part of the mine, they built a very large electric railroad system. It was all run by electricity. And those railroad trains went inside that hillside over there very extensively, yes. And then they could fill the carts in there and bring them back out, to the mills. Yeah, most of these guys went underground and they didn't see daylight for 8 hours.
That's a long time.
It is. Yeah, it's a hard life, very hard life. And you might ask, well, why did they do that? And the biggest reason is that it paid so well. Most of the jobs around here didn't pay well, and they could make a lot of money working in the mine. They found out that the streams and rivers around here were all polluted because of the mine. The Environmental Protection Agency came in here and said, this is a Superfund site. We're going to spend millions of dollars, and they did. They spent, I don't know, probably more money fixing that site up than they ever made in profits out of the place, which is kind of not so good. but it became a 12-year project to repair the place. So that what you see up there is a field.
So, when me and my class went on this trip, we saw a stone archway in the slough area. Was that an entrance to the mine?
Absolutely. That's exactly what it was. It is an entrance. In mining terms, it's called an adit. A-D-I-T. You and I would just call it opening to a tunnel. There are two ways to get in the mine. You go into the side of the hill, or you go up to the top and go down from the top, like that. You can go down in a cage, or you can go in on a train or walk in. Yep.
While we were on a field trip to see the mine, we saw this two-story building with, and it had two doors. One was at the top where no one could reach it, and the other was at the bottom. And the one at the bottom had a combination lock on it, and we were wondering what it was.
That building covers a shaft. A shaft is where men were lowered into the ground. There, they had an apparatus like an elevator. You've ridden in an elevator in a building, up and down between the floors. Well, that's how they got from the ground level down into the mine. How deep do you think it might have been, some of those?
A half a mile, a mile?
Not quite, but hundreds of feet down, that's for sure. Yeah, I think the deepest shaft here was 500 and something feet. That's pretty far underground.
What is a large machine with a wide belt on it?
Scott showed that to me. I wish I knew. But the clue is, part of it is that it is steam powered, obviously, I think, which makes it go back a ways, probably to early 1900s. And they did not have electricity. The first electricity came up here to the mine in 1912. A man named Heckscher, who owned the mine at the time, built a huge dam clear across the White River. There was a great big dam down there, and it had turbines in it and produced electricity just for the mine. He wouldn't share it with any of the town up here, but he did produce electricity for the mine. And that's the first time they had electricity up there. Before that, they had to use steam power. So that tells you that that piece of equipment is before 1912.
Could you briefly explain the process of mining the copper ore and what happens to it?
Okay. First thing they did was they sent people down with like a drill, and they would go in the tunnel, and they would push the drill into the side wall, and it would bring out something like that. And they would take this, and they would take it into their chemistry shop, which would be here. They would pulverize it into a powder, and then treat it with chemicals, and that would tell them how much copper was in this. And they would go around in the mine, in the tunnels, doing that, and then they could tell the miners where they should go and drill or dynamite to get the best copper. And then they would use dynamite or whatever drills, and they would come out with big chunks of stuff. And they had a grate in the floor, and they would scrape it. That was a machine over there, a big metal apparatus, but they would scrape the ore out of that came out over top of the grate, and the smaller pieces would go through. And then down a chute that would go, and then we're getting into the railroad car. They would dump it into the railroad car, and we'll say it was in a shaft over here. The railroad car would run along here to these buildings, and it would dump the ore out, and all the pieces of ore would be about like big rocks like that, about 18 inches across. They would put it into one of these buildings where they had a crusher, like a jaw-like machine that would break the rocks down into pieces, and they would crush them down to like that size. That's a piece, actually. And now that was then put on a conveyor belt, and taken into another building where there were huge tubes. They were taller than I am, and they were 6 feet across, or 9 feet across even. And they were set on their sides, and they were empty inside, and they would shove these rocks in there by the hundreds. And inside these big cylinders, they had steel balls, about 2.5 inches across, round steel balls. And they put water and steel balls on there. Then these cylinders would turn. Guess what would happen to this?
It would crush it.
It would crush it. It would make it really tiny, and it would make it down to about that big. They tried to get it down to a 1/2 inch size. Then it would go along on a conveyor belt and be dumped into a tank full of chemicals and water. And that would then be pushed farther along into troughs. And the troughs would have air sent up through them. And this is the magical part, because of the chemistry involved. Air containing oxygen coming up through the water would make bubbles. And the copper that was in the little tiny pieces would stick to the bubbles. And then they would have this like froth, like when you shake a can of soda or something, and it all fizzes up, and they would scrape that off. And that's what they worked with. And that had the purest copper in it. And they would take that down to a place that was covered with canvas, and they had like a shop vac, a giant shop vac underneath it, a vacuum thing that would suck the water out of it, and it would leave on the canvas a mat of coppery stuff. They would take that off in big cakes, throw it in a truck, take it down to the train station down near Norwich, and away it went. And it went down to New York, New Jersey for the most part. And out of that came, through smelters, something that looked like this, pure copper. It came out in flat sheets, or you could use another process and you could make wires for telephones, telegraph, anything.